What if the fiercest king in the north discovered his entire pack was worth less than a crust of bread? Disguised as a wanderer, a 32-year-old alpha watches his kingdom fail every test, until a 19-year-old omega with nothing to spare shatters his certainty with one act of kindness. But when he reveals who he really is, everything detonates. And what follows remakes Frostmoor from the ground up. The first thing Leora remembered was cold. Not the crisp, clean cold of winter mornings when frost painted delicate patterns on window panes, but the brutal, bone-deep cold of hunger and abandonment. She had been 5 years old when her mother's cough finally won its long battle, leaving her alone in a world that had no patience for orphaned Omega children. The memory lived in her body still, the weight of her mother's hand going slack in hers, the silence that followed the rattling breath, the way the candle flame had wavered as if uncertain whether to continue burning in a room now emptied of hope. The village of Millbrook, nestled in the shadow of Frostmoor's capital walls, had no use for charity. When the neighbors came to clear out the tiny cottage, they took everything of value: the iron pot, the wool blankets, even the chipped plates that had belonged to Leora's grandmother. They left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a warning delivered in tones of practiced cruelty. She had 3 days to vacate the property before the landlord came to claim it for unpaid rent. No one offered to take her in. No one suggested the orphanage, though it existed on the far side of town. Omegas, they said among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear, were plentiful as weeds. One less mouth to feed was a blessing, not a tragedy. Leora learned to survive in the cracks between things. She slept in the space beneath the baker's back stairs, where the warmth from the ovens crept through the floorboards and the smell of rising dough filled her dreams with phantom fullness. She ate what she could scavenge, crusts dropped by careless customers, bruised apples from behind the market stalls, once an entire half-loaf of bread thrown out for being a day old, which she had hidden and rationed for a week. The baker, a broad-shouldered beta woman named Margaret with flour perpetually dusting her forearms, pretended not to notice the small Omega child living beneath her shop. It was not kindness, exactly, but neither was it cruelty. It was the careful indifference that allowed survival without requiring acknowledgement. When Leora turned 8, Margaret finally spoke to her directly. "You've been stealing my discards for 3 years," she said, not unkindly. "You might as well earn them." Thus began Leora's apprenticeship, if it could be called that. She worked from before dawn until after dusk, carrying sacks of flour that were nearly as heavy as she was, scrubbing pans until her small hands were raw, feeding the ovens with wood that left splinters embedded in her palms. In exchange, she received a corner of the back room to sleep in, 2 meals a day, and the kind of exhausted peace that comes from being too tired to remember what had been lost. The years blurred together like dough kneaded too long, elastic and formless, marked only by the gradual lengthening of her limbs and the deepening of her understanding that this was all life would offer her. Frostmoor was ruled by Alpha King Rowan Thorn, a name spoken with varying degrees of reverence and fear depending on whom you asked, but his reign existed in a realm so far removed from Millbrook's daily struggles that he might as well have been a character in a fairy tale. Kings did not concern themselves with Omega Baker's assistance. Kings did not walk the muddy streets where Leora hauled water from the well each morning, her shoulders aching from buckets that never seemed to grow lighter, no matter how much she grew. By the time Leora reached 19, she had learned to make herself small in every way that mattered. She kept her eyes down when alphas passed, knowing that direct eye contact could be interpreted as challenge or invitation, both equally dangerous for someone of her status. She wore dresses that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches, gray and brown garments that helped her blend into the background of daily commerce. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, only as much as absolutely necessary. The dreams she had once harbored, foolish, childish dreams of learning to read, of traveling beyond Millbrook's boundaries, of being something more than a perpetual servant, had been slowly crushed beneath the weight of years and exhaustion. The lower district of Frostmoor's capital, where Millbrook resided, was a place of deliberate neglect. The cobblestones that lined the streets in the upper quarters, where wealthy betas and alphas conducted their business, gave way to packed dirt that turned to sucking mud with every rain. The buildings leaned against each other like drunken companions, their timber frames warped with age and poor maintenance, their thatched roofs perpetually in need of repair. Water from the public wells ran brown more often than clear, and sickness moved through the cramped neighborhoods with grim regularity, taking the very young and very old with particular enthusiasm. Omegas comprised nearly half the lower district's population, yet they held no positions of authority, owned no businesses of significance, and were excluded from the pack councils that made decisions affecting their lives. They worked as servants, laundresses, seamstresses, and laborers, their wages kept deliberately low by an unspoken agreement among employers that to pay one omega fairly would create expectations among all the others. It was a system maintained not through explicit laws but through the more insidious mechanism of custom, that word used to justify every injustice that benefited those already in power. Leora had learned not to question this arrangement. What purpose would questioning serve? The world was as it was. Kings ruled from distant palaces, alphas held power and privilege, betas occupied the middling spaces of commerce and craft, and omegas bent their backs to work that broke their bodies by middle age. This was the natural order, or so she had been told countless times by countless voices, each one certain of their own wisdom. On the morning that would change everything, though Leora could not know this as she rose in the gray pre-dawn light, she woke with the particular weariness that comes from too many consecutive days of insufficient rest. Margaret had taken on additional orders for the upcoming harvest festival, which meant longer hours and heavier work. In addition to her duties at the bakery, Leora had recently taken a second job washing linens for a boarding house 3 streets over, the extra coins necessary to save toward her own rent somewhere, anywhere, that might offer slightly better conditions than the back room she currently occupied. She dressed quickly in the cold, her breath misting in the air. The back room had no hearth of its own, and though warmth seeped through from the bakery's main space, it was never quite enough to banish the chill completely. Her dress, patched at both elbows and along one shoulder seam, hung loose on her thin frame. There had been a time when she had curves, the soft roundness that omega bodies naturally developed, but years of insufficient food had carved them away, leaving her angular and sharp-edged as broken pottery. The bakery was already warm when she entered the main space, the ovens having been lit by Margaret an hour earlier. The older woman stood at the long wooden work table, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she shaped loaves from risen dough. She glanced up at Leora's entrance, her expression as neutral as always, and jerked her head toward the corner where sacks of flour waited to be moved. "Festival orders are doubled," Margaret said without preamble. "We'll need twice the usual amount of everything. Start with bringing up those sacks, then prepare the rye dough. And mind you don't waste anything. Flour's gone up again." Everything was always going up. The price of flour, of salt, of firewood, of rent. Only wages remained stubbornly fixed, as immovable as the mountains that ringed Frostmore's northern border. Leora nodded silently and moved to begin her work, hoisting the first sack with a grunt of effort. The rough burlap scraped against her shoulder as she maneuvered it across the room, and she felt the familiar pull of muscles work to their limit and then pushed beyond. The morning proceeded in its usual rhythm of labor. Leora hauled and measured and mixed, her hands moving automatically through tasks performed so many times they required no conscious thought. Through the front windows, she could see the street beginning to wake, merchants opening shutters, children being sent to fetch water, the occasional alpha striding past with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never questioned their right to take up space in the world. It was nearly midday when Leora first noticed the beggar. He appeared at the edge of her vision as she was carrying a basket of day-old bread to the front display, the loaves that would be sold at reduced price to customers who couldn't afford fresh. He stood across the street, leaning heavily against the wall of the cooper's shop, and even from a distance, Leora could see the tremor in his limbs, the way he seemed barely able to remain upright. Frostmore had no shortage of beggars, especially in the lower district. The elderly whose families could not support them, the injured who could no longer work, the simple-minded who could find no place in a society that valued productivity above all else. They congregated in doorways and alleys, their hands perpetually outstretched, their voices raised in pleas that most passers-by had learned to ignore. Leora herself had nothing to give them, existing as she did only slightly above that line herself, but she had never learned the art of looking through them as if they were invisible. This particular beggar was male. That much was apparent despite the filthy, tattered cloak that obscured his form. His face was partly hidden by a hood, but she could see dark hair matted with dirt, a beard grown wild and unkempt, and eyes that seemed to track the movement of every person who passed with an intensity that spoke of sharp awareness, despite obvious physical weakness. As Leora watched, he made a tentative step forward, hand extended toward a well-dressed beta woman who recoiled as if he carried plague, gathering her skirts and hurrying past without acknowledgement. Leora turned back to her work, pushing the image from her mind. She had learned long ago that sympathy changed nothing and only added to her own burden of exhaustion. The world contained more suffering than any one person could address, and she was herself barely surviving. This was what she told herself as she continued through her afternoon tasks, moving between oven and table, kneading and shaping and baking in the endless cycle of bread production. But when she left the bakery at dusk, her day's work finally complete, the beggar was still there. He had slid down to sit against the wall, his head tilted back, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. The street had emptied as people retreated to their homes for evening meals, and in the long shadows cast by the setting sun, he seemed utterly alone in a way that struck something deep in Leora's chest. A recognition, perhaps, of what her own fate might have been had Margaret not offered her work all those years ago. She stopped walking, standing in the middle of the street, and took inventory of what she possessed. In her pocket was the half loaf of bread that constituted her evening meal, slightly stale but filling enough to quiet the constant gnawing in her stomach. She had eaten already today, the morning porridge that was part of her wages, and a heel of bread at midday. This evening portion was more than some had. The calculation was simple arithmetic. She could afford to go hungry tonight. She had done so before, and would doubtless do so again. Before she could reconsider, before the sensible part of her mind that had learned to guard every resource could reassert control, Leora crossed the street and approached the beggar. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his 30s, though the grime and exhaustion made it difficult to judge accurately. His clothes, though torn and filthy, had once been of decent quality, suggesting a fall from better circumstances rather than a lifetime of poverty. "Excuse me," she said softly, crouching down to be at his eye level. "Sir?" He opened his eyes. They were gray, she noticed, the color of stone or winter skies, and focused on her with effort. There was something startling in his gaze, an intelligence and alertness that seemed at odds with his physical condition. "I have bread," Leora continued, pulling the half-loaf from her pocket. "It's not fresh, but it's good. Would you like it?" For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to determine whether she was real or some hunger-induced hallucination. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the bread from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a contact that sent an odd tingle up her arm. Probably just the cold, she thought, though the evening was not particularly frigid. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough from disuse but cultured in a way that confirmed her suspicion about his origins. "You're very kind." Leora shook her head. "It's just bread. I hope it helps." She stood, preparing to continue home, but hesitated. "The well is 2 streets that way," she added, pointing. "The water's cleaner than most, and the church sometimes gives out soup at sunset, though you'd need to hurry." He nodded slowly, still watching her with those peculiar gray eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. She should not have answered. It was not wise to give personal information to strangers, and despite her momentary sympathy, this man was still a stranger, potentially dangerous despite his current weakness. But there was something in his gaze that made her respond honestly. "Leora," she said. "Leora Hale. Leora," he repeated, as if tasting the sound of it. "Thank you, Leora Hale. I won't forget this kindness." The word seemed oddly formal, almost ceremonial, but Leora attributed this to his obvious education and former status. She nodded once more and then continued on her way, her stomach already beginning to protest the absence of its expected meal, her mind already pushing the encounter toward the category of things that did not matter in the larger scheme of her survival. She could not know, as she walked the darkening streets toward her small room behind the bakery, that the man she had just fed was Alpha King Rowan Thorne, ruler of all Frostmoor, who had disguised himself and descended into the lower districts to test the true character of his people. She could not know that this moment, this simple transaction of bread and compassion, would set in motion events that would alter the course of her entire life. She knew only that she had done what seemed right in the moment, that she was hungry and tired, and that tomorrow would bring another day of endless labor that was somehow preferable to the alternative of having nothing at all. The night settled over Millbrook like a worn blanket, threadbare and insufficient but better than complete exposure to the elements. Leora lay on her pallet in the back room, listening to the settling sounds of the building around her, and tried not to think about food or futures, or the strange gray eyes of a beggar who had looked at her as if she were something more than just another Omega struggling to survive in a world that had no particular use for her continued existence. Sleep came eventually, as it always did, bringing with it dreams of warmth and bread and hands that held hers with gentleness rather than calculation or indifference. In the morning, everything would change, but for now, she slept. The Beggar King, Part 2. The beggar returned the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time, Leora found him in roughly the same location, sometimes leaning against the cooper's shop, sometimes sitting in the narrow alley between the chandler's storefront and the boarding house, once huddled beneath the overhang of the abandoned stable at the corner where two streets intersected. He never asked her for anything directly, never approached her with outstretched hand or voiced plea, but his presence became a fixture in the landscape of her daily routine, as familiar as the crack in the bakery's front step or the loose cobblestone that always collected rainwater near the well. Leora told herself she should ignore him. Every practical instinct she had developed over 19 years of hardship screamed that she could not afford to share her meager resources with anyone, that survival was a solitary endeavor, that kindness was a luxury reserved for those with surplus. Yet each evening, as she left the bakery with her small portion of bread, or sometimes a bun that had burned slightly on one side and thus been deemed unsellable, she found her feet carrying her across the street to where he waited. Their conversations began tentatively, built on the foundation of those brief exchanges of food and gratitude. The first few times, Leora said nothing beyond a quiet greeting, pressing the bread into his hands and hurrying away before she could second-guess the decision. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the interactions lengthened. He began asking her questions, small ones at first, easily answered. How long had she worked at the bakery? Had she always lived in Millbrook? Did she have family? The last question should have hurt, should have reopened the wound of her mother's death and the village's subsequent abandonment of her. But somehow his manner of asking stripped away the usual pain. He listened to her halting answers with an attention that felt rare and valuable, his gray eyes never leaving her face, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying. When she explained that she had been alone since age 5, he nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he had suspected, and said only, "That must have been difficult. You've done well to survive." No one had ever framed her life in terms of achievement before. She existed, she labored, she continued. These were simply facts of her reality, neither praiseworthy nor condemnable. But the way he spoke made survival itself seem like a victory worth acknowledging, and something tight in Leora's chest loosened slightly, though she could not have named what it was. She learned things about him too, though he shared information cautiously, parceling out details like a miser counting coins. His name, he said, was Rowan, just Rowan, no family name offered. He had traveled extensively before falling on hard times, which explained his educated manner of speech. He had once had work that involved— He paused here, seeming to search for words, observing people and situations. When Leora asked what had happened to bring him to his current circumstances, a shadow crossed his face, and he said only that he had made choices that led to consequences and was now learning things he should have understood long ago. The cryptic nature of his responses should have raised suspicion, but Leora found herself oddly unconcerned with whatever secrets he might be harboring. Everyone in the lower district carried secrets, shameful pasts, illegal activities undertaken out of desperation, identities shed and reconstructed out of necessity. It was an unspoken rule that you did not pry too deeply into another person's history, because inviting such scrutiny meant opening yourself to the same. What mattered more than his past was his presence in her present. Slowly, without quite meaning to, Leora began to look forward to their evening conversations. After days filled with Margaret's curt commands and the endless physical demands of the bakery work, after the additional hours spent scrubbing linens at the boarding house until her hands were red and wrinkled, the few minutes she spent talking with Rowan became something like respite. He never complained about his own situation, never demanded more than she offered, and somehow managed to make her feel less alone in a way she had not experienced since her mother's death. 2 weeks into this strange routine, Margaret finally commented on Leora's behavior. "You've been giving away your supper to that beggar," she said bluntly as they cleaned the work surfaces after the day's final baking. It was not a question. Leora's hands stilled on the cloth she was using to wipe down the table. She should have known the baker would notice. Margaret missed very little that occurred in her immediate domain. "He's hungry," she said simply, unable to articulate anything more complex than this basic truth. Margaret made a sound somewhere between a snort and a sigh. "They're all hungry. You going to feed every beggar in Frostmoor? You'll starve yourself doing that." "Just one," Leora replied quietly. "I can manage." The older woman studied her for a long moment, her flour-dusted hands planted on her broad hips, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "Your business, I suppose. But don't come crying to me when you collapse from lack of food. I need you working, not wasting away over some stranger who'll move on soon enough anyway." But Rowan did not move on. As the days stretched into weeks, he remained a constant presence, and the conversations deepened into something that felt almost like friendship, though Leora had little experience with such things to compare. He seemed genuinely interested in the details of her daily life, asking about the intricacies of bread making, about the other residents of Millbrook, about her observations of the world around her. His questions had a quality of focused attention that made even the most mundane aspects of her existence seem worthy of examination. She found herself telling him things she had never voiced aloud. Small frustrations about how the upper district merchants looked through lower district residents as if they were invisible. Quiet dreams of someday learning to read properly rather than just recognizing the handful of words necessary for bakery work. Observations about the unfairness of how omegas were treated compared to betas and alphas. With anyone else, such admissions would have felt dangerous, exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But Rowan listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that pushed her to think more deeply about situations she had simply accepted as unchangeable. "Why do you think it's organized that way?" he asked one evening when she had mentioned how omegas were excluded from the pack councils. "What purpose does it serve to exclude half the population from decisions that affect them?" Leora had never considered that there might be a why that went beyond, "that's how it's always been." She frowned, turning the question over in her mind. "Control, I suppose," she said slowly. "It's easier to keep people working for low wages if they have no voice in challenging the arrangement. And..." She hesitated, then continued. "I think some people need others to be beneath them. It makes them feel secure in their own position." Rowan nodded, something gleaming in his eyes that might have been approval or perhaps satisfaction at having his own thoughts confirmed. "That's very perceptive," he said. "Most people accept the structures they're born into without examining their foundations." "What good does examining do?" Leora asked, a edge of bitterness creeping into her voice despite her attempt to suppress it. "I can see the unfairness clearly enough, but seeing doesn't change anything. The world is what it is." "Is it?" Rowan's voice was soft but intense. Or is it what we collectively agree to let it be? The question unsettled something in Leora, suggesting possibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Change implied hope, and hope was dangerous for someone in her position. It made the present harder to bear by illuminating what could be but wasn't. She changed the subject after that, asking instead about his travels, and Rowan allowed the redirection, though she sensed he had more to say on the matter. The Harvest Festival arrived with the sudden bustle that marked all seasonal celebrations. The Upper District decorated its streets with garlands and banners. Merchants set up special stalls selling candied fruits and spiced wine. And even the Lower District caught some spillover of festivity, though the celebrations there were markedly more subdued. For Leora, the festival meant 3 days of intensified labor, as the bakery struggled to meet the increased demand for festival breads and special pastries that Margaret only made at this time of year. She barely slept during those 3 days, snatching a few hours of rest between marathon baking sessions, her hands moving automatically through familiar motions while her mind grew foggy with exhaustion. On the second night of the festival, she emerged from the bakery well after dark, so tired she swayed on her feet and realized with a pang of guilt that she had no food to share. She had been too busy even to eat her own portions, surviving on crusts snatched between tasks. But Rowan was there anyway, sitting in his usual spot, and when he saw her, he stood with effort and crossed to meet her. "You look exhausted," he said, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "You should rest." "I will," Leora said, though they both knew it was a lie. She would collapse onto her pallet for a few hours before rising again to begin the next day's work. "I'm sorry. I don't have anything for you tonight. The festival orders—" "Leora," he interrupted gently, "I'm not here for the food. I mean, I appreciate it, of course, but—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words, which was unusual for someone normally so articulate. "Your company matters more than the bread." Something in Leora's chest constricted and expanded simultaneously, a sensation she could not name but that brought tears suddenly close to the surface. No one had ever suggested that her company, her mere presence, had value independent of her labor. She was useful for her work, tolerated for her silence, ignored for her low status, but valued simply for existing. The concept was foreign and overwhelming. "I should go," she managed, her voice rough. "I need to sleep." Rowan nodded, but as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Leora, thank you for seeing me, for treating me as if I matter. You have no idea how rare that is." She glanced back at him, this strange man who had somehow become the unexpected bright spot in her grinding existence, and managed a tired smile. "You do matter," she said, meaning it. "Everyone does, even if the world pretends otherwise." The words stayed with her as she lay in her small room that night, too exhausted for sleep despite desperately needing it. She thought about visibility and invisibility, about who was seen and who was overlooked, about the strange alchemy that had transformed a beggar from background scenery into someone whose absence would leave a void in her daily life. It frightened her slightly, this growing attachment to someone whose circumstances were even more precarious than her own, but she lacked the energy to examine the fear too closely before exhaustion finally claimed her. The festival concluded with the traditional harvest blessing ceremony, conducted by the pack's ceremonial leader in the Upper District's main square. Leora did not attend. Such events were technically open to all pack members, but Lower District Omegas understood without being explicitly told that their presence was not desired in the crush of well-dressed celebrants. Instead, she heard about it secondhand from Margaret, who had closed the bakery briefly to watch from the square's periphery. "Alpha King made an appearance," Margaret reported as they cleaned the ovens the following day, their first moment of relative calm after the festival frenzy. "First time in months he's shown his face at a public ceremony. Looked stern as death, barely smiled even when the children presented the harvest wreaths. Some are saying he's been troubled lately, distracted. Rumors of unrest in the Northern Territories, or perhaps just the weight of rule wearing on him." Leora made a non-committal sound, her attention only half focused on Margaret's words. The Alpha King was a distant figure of authority, relevant to her life only in the abstract sense that all rulers were relevant. Their decisions filtered down through layers of bureaucracy and custom to shape the conditions in which she struggled to survive, but she would never see him, never interact with him, never have cause to think of him as anything more than a name invoked when discussing politics she had no power to influence. "They say he's not bonded yet," Margaret continued, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn spot of burned dough. 32 years old and still no mate. The council's pressuring him to choose someone. Form an alliance with one of the major alpha families. Usual political maneuvering. The detail meant nothing to Leora, but she nodded as if it did, knowing Margaret would wind down eventually if given space to exhaust the topic. The lives of rulers and their mating politics existed in a realm so far removed from her own concerns that they might as well have been discussing events on the moon. What mattered was whether she could save enough coins in the next few months to afford slightly better lodgings, whether the boarding house would continue needing her laundering services through the winter, whether Margaret's health would hold so the bakery remained operational and Leora remained employed. That evening, Rowan was waiting in his customary spot, but something about his demeanor seemed different. He stood straighter, his expression more focused, as if some decision had been made that lent him new energy despite his continued physical weakness. When Leora approached with her half loaf of bread, today it was rye, dense and dark, he took it with both hands, cradling it almost reverently. "I'll be leaving soon," he said abruptly, and Leora felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "Not immediately, but within the week. I have responsibilities I've neglected. Things I need to address." "Oh," Leora said, and was embarrassed by how small her voice sounded. "Of course. You have your own life to manage. I understand." "I don't think you do," Rowan said, his gray eyes searching her face with that peculiar intensity. "I need to tell you something, Leora. The truth, or at least part of it. I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am and why I'm here." Fear flashed through her. Perhaps he was a criminal, dangerous, someone she should never have approached. But looking at him, at the sincerity written across his features, she found the fear hard to sustain. "You don't owe me explanations," she said carefully. "Everyone has their privacy. But I want to explain," he insisted. "You deserve to know that this," he gestured at his tattered clothing, his unkempt appearance. "This isn't the whole picture. I came to Millbrook, to the lower district, deliberately, as a test." "A test?" Leora repeated, confused. "I'd heard things," Rowan said slowly, "about how people in certain parts of the realm treated those less fortunate. I wanted to see for myself whether the stories were true, whether compassion still existed, or whether self-interest had consumed everything." He paused, then added softly, "You've been the only person in 2 weeks who treated me as human, who saw past the exterior to the person underneath." Leora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't do anything special. It was just bread." "It was never just bread," Rowan said firmly. "It was kindness when you had little to spare. It was conversation when I was being ignored by everyone else. It was dignity offered to someone society deemed unworthy of it. Those things matter, Leora. They matter more than you know." She didn't know what to say to this, so she said nothing, simply stood there in the gathering dusk and tried to process what felt like an ending, though she couldn't articulate what was ending or why it hurt more than she had expected. "When I leave," Rowan continued, "things are going to change. I can't explain fully now, but I need you to remember something. You have worth, not because of what you do or who you serve, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your strength, your refusal to become callous despite everything you've endured. Those qualities are rare and valuable. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." "You're talking like we won't see each other again," Leora said, and hated the tremor in her voice. Rowan's expression grew complicated, mixing regret and something else she couldn't identify. "We will," he said. "I promise you that. But when we do, circumstances will be different. Very different. I only ask that you remember these conversations. Remember that before anything else, We were simply two people talking honestly with each other." The cryptic nature of his words frustrated her, but Leora nodded, sensing that pushing for clarity would yield nothing. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the evening settling around them. Distant voices, the clatter of shutters being closed, a dog barking several streets away. Then Rowan reached out and briefly touched her hand, the contact sending that same odd tingle through her that she had felt the first night. "Thank you, Leora Hale," he said formally, "for everything. You've changed more than you can possibly understand." Then he turned and walked away, his gait steadier than she had seen in all their previous encounters, as if whatever had weakened him was beginning to release its hold. Leora watched until he disappeared around the corner, then returned to the bakery with an inexplicable sense of loss weighing on her chest. She told herself she was being foolish. That attachment to a homeless stranger was absurd, that his departure was inevitable, and she should be relieved to no longer be sharing her scarce food. But the practical arguments did nothing to ease the ache of impending absence. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work and waiting. Each evening, Leora looked for Rowan in his usual spots, but he did not appear. The places where he had stood or sat seemed emptier than they had before she knew him, as if his presence had filled space she had not noticed was vacant until now. She found herself inventing reasons why he might return. Perhaps his departure had been delayed, perhaps he had reconsidered, perhaps he would come to say a proper goodbye. But the street corners remained stubbornly empty of him. On the 4th day after his announcement, Margaret arrived at the bakery in a state of unusual agitation, her normally impassive face flushed with excitement. "The Kings called a general assembly," she announced, practically vibrating with the news. "Tomorrow at midday in the Upper District Square. All PAC members are required to attend. Even us, even the Lower District folks. He's making some kind of announcement about reforms and judgments." The criers were out at dawn spreading the word. Leora's hands continued their work of kneading dough, the rhythm so ingrained she could perform it without conscious thought. "Do you know what it's about?" she asked without much interest. Royal pronouncements rarely affected the daily realities of lower district life in any meaningful way. "No one knows," Margaret said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "But requiring everyone to attend? That's unusual. Must be significant. We'll have to close the bakery for it. Can't very well refuse a royal summons." The prospect of attending a royal assembly held no appeal for Leora. She would have to stand for hours in a crowd of better-dressed, higher-status PAC members who would regard her presence as at best an inconvenience and at worst an affront. She would be jostled and overlooked and made to feel her inferior position with every passing moment. But Margaret was right. Refusing to attend was not an option. The Alpha King's word was law, and even Omegas from the lower district were still technically PAC members, subject to the same commands as everyone else. The next morning arrived with autumn crispness, the air sharp and clear. Leora dressed in her least patched dress, though it still marked her clearly as lower district, and pulled her dark hair back in a simple braid. Margaret closed the bakery with evident reluctance, muttering about lost business, and together they joined the steady stream of people making their way toward the upper district. The walk itself was a journey through Frostmore's rigid social stratification. The streets grew cleaner and wider as they progressed, the buildings transitioning from the leaning wooden structures of the lower district to the solid stone edifices of the merchant quarter, and finally, to the grand architecture of the upper district where alphas and the wealthiest betas resided. Leora had only been this far into the city a handful of times in her life, and each time the contrast between this world and her own struck her with renewed force. The main square was already crowded by the time they arrived, bodies pressed together in a mass of varied clothing that nevertheless sorted itself into visible clusters, the well-dressed in the center and front, the working classes on the periphery, the lowest status members like Leora relegated to the very edges where they could barely see over the heads of those in front. She found a spot near a fountain and resigned herself to hours of waiting and discomfort. The murmur of conversation filled the square, speculation and rumor passing through the crowd like ripples on water. Some said the king was going to announce a new tax. Others claimed he planned to expand Frostmore's territory through conquest or marriage alliance. A few voices suggested more ominous possibilities: a threat from the northern territories, a challenge to his rule, a plague spreading from the outer villages. Leora listened without engaging, her attention drifting to the grand platform that had been erected at the square's center, draped with Frostmour's banners and clearly intended for the king's address. The crowd settled gradually into expectant silence as the sun reached its zenith. Then, accompanied by what seemed like half the palace guard in formal regalia, Alpha King Rowan Thorn emerged onto the platform, and Leora's world tilted sideways and refused to right itself. It was him, the beggar. Rowan, but not a beggar at all. Every inch a king, dressed in formal robes that spoke of authority and wealth, his hair clean and styled, his beard properly trimmed, his bearing transformed from weakness to unmistakable power. He stood at the platform's edge and surveyed the crowd with those same gray eyes she had come to know, and Leora felt ice water flood through her veins as understanding crashed over her in sickening waves. The test he had mentioned, the observation of how people treated the less fortunate, the educated speech and the cryptic comments about responsibilities and things changing, gods above and below. She had been feeding the Alpha King table scraps and talking to him about the unfairness of Omega treatment and the inadequacy of lower district conditions. She had casually criticized the very system he ruled, had treated him with the comfortable familiarity of friendship rather than the deference his position demanded, Leora's thoughts spiraled into panic. She needed to leave immediately before he saw her in the crowd. This was humiliation beyond bearing, and potentially dangerous besides. What if he interpreted her actions as some kind of manipulation, an Omega trying to curry favor through false kindness? What if he was angry that she had not shown proper respect? But it was too late to flee. The king was speaking, his voice carrying across the square with practiced projection, and people were pressing too close around her for easy escape. She could only stand frozen and listen as he began his address. The Beggar King, Part 3, Citizens of Frostmour. The king's voice rang out across the assembled crowd, and Leora felt her knees weaken at the sound of it. The same voice that had thanked her for bread, that had asked her thoughtful questions about her life, that had told her she mattered. I stand before you today to speak of truth, justice, and the responsibility we bear to one another as members of the same pack. The crowd listened in attentive silence, the kind of silence that held both respect and wariness. Alpha King Rowan Thorn had ruled for 7 years, ascending to the throne after his father's death from a wasting illness. His reign had been marked by military victories against raiders from the mountain territories and careful management of Frostmour's resources through 2 harsh winters, but he had maintained a certain distance from his people, conducting rule largely through councils and intermediaries. This direct address was unusual, and the assembled pack members seemed to sense its significance. 3 weeks ago, the king continued, I made a decision that some among my advisors considered foolish, perhaps even dangerous. I removed the trappings of my position and walked among you as one of the least and most vulnerable, as a homeless beggar with nothing to my name, dependent entirely on the compassion of strangers for survival. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd, voices rising in surprise before settling again as people strained to hear more. Leora felt Margaret's sharp intake of breath beside her, felt the baker's eyes cut toward her with sudden understanding, but she could not tear her own gaze from the platform where the king stood. I did this, Rowan said, his voice carrying clear authority, but also something that might have been pain, because disturbing reports had reached me. Reports of corruption among merchants, of cruelty toward those without status or protection, of a growing callousness in how we treat our most vulnerable pack members. I needed to know if these reports were isolated incidents or symptoms of something deeper. I needed to see for myself what kind of people we have become when no one believes they are being watched. The crowd had gone utterly still now, every person holding their breath, aware that judgment was coming, though not yet knowing in what form. Leora's heart hammered against her ribs with such force she wondered if those around her could hear it. She wanted to close her eyes, to disappear, to be anywhere but trapped in this crowd listening to the king dissect the 2 weeks she had spent unknowingly befriending him. "What I discovered," Rowan said, and his voice hardened like iron, "shames me as your king and shames us as a pack. For 2 weeks, I presented myself at shops and homes, at churches and public spaces. I asked for food, for water, for the smallest acknowledgement of my humanity. Do you know how many people helped me? How many showed even basic compassion to someone they believed was beneath their concern?" He let the question hang in the air, let the silence grow uncomfortable, before delivering his answer with cold precision. 12. Out of hundreds, perhaps thousands who saw me, exactly 12 people offered genuine assistance. And most of those 12 were themselves struggling, people who could barely feed their own families sharing what little they had. The wealthy merchants who could spare a coin without noticing its absence? They stepped over me as if I were refuse. The comfortable families with full larders, they closed their doors in my face. The religious leaders who preached charity from their pulpits, they called guards to move me away from their establishments. Leora could see people in the crowd shifting uncomfortably, some looking ashamed, others defensive, all of them recalculating their recent actions and wondering if they had been among those tested and found wanting. The king's strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. No one could be certain whether they had passed or failed, which meant everyone would feel the weight of potential judgment. "This is not the Frostmoor I wish to rule," Rowan continued, his voice rising with controlled passion. "A pack's strength is not measured by the might of its warriors or the wealth of its treasuries. It is measured by how we treat those with nothing, no status, no power, no ability to repay kindness with anything beyond gratitude. When we fail in this, when we become a society that values only what benefits ourselves directly, we lose something essential to our humanity." He paused, letting his words settle, and Leora saw something shift in his expression, a softening, a hint of the person she had known during their evening conversations. "But I also discovered something else during my time among you. I discovered that compassion has not been entirely extinguished, that goodness still exists even in circumstances that would seem to justify its absence. I met people who had every reason to hoard their resources, to protect themselves first and ignore everyone else, yet who chose differently, who saw a stranger in need and responded with kindness even though it cost them something they could not easily spare." Leora's stomach clenched. She knew, with the horrible certainty of someone watching an inevitable disaster approach, what was coming next. She wanted to scream at him to stop, to not do this, to not expose her to the attention of the entire pack. She was nothing, no one, meant to remain invisible in the margins of society where people like her belonged. Being singled out, being named, being pulled into the light, it would destroy the careful invisibility that had protected her for so long. "One person in particular," Rowan said, and his eyes were scanning the crowd now, searching, "showed me what it means to live with genuine integrity. She had nothing. I mean that literally. She was an Omega working 2 jobs just to afford basic shelter and food, surviving on scraps. Exhausted to the point of collapse. Every logical calculation suggested she should ignore me, that she could not afford to share anything with someone even more unfortunate. Yet she stopped. Every single evening for 2 weeks, she stopped and shared her food with me. She talked with me as if I were a person worth knowing rather than an inconvenience to be avoided. She treated me with dignity when everyone else treated me as invisible." "No," Leora thought desperately. "Please, no. Don't do this." She asked nothing in return. The king continued, and there was something in his voice now that Leora recognized from their conversations, a raw honesty that cut through all pretense. "She didn't know who I was. She gained nothing from her kindness, except the satisfaction of having helped another person. That is the spirit I wish to see throughout Frostmoor. That is the kind of pack member we should all aspire to be." He raised his hand, gesturing to someone Leora couldn't see. "Guards, please escort Leora Hale to the platform." The crowd exploded into murmurs, heads turning, people craning to see who had been named. Leora felt Margaret's hand grip her arm. Whether in support or shock, she couldn't tell. Then palace guards were moving through the crowd toward her, their armor gleaming in the midday sun, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Nothing to do but allow herself to be guided forward through the parting masses of pack members. The walk to the platform felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. Leora was aware of hundreds of eyes on her, of the whispers rising like wind through tall grass, of the weight of her shabby dress and work-worn hands, and complete inadequacy for whatever was happening. The guards were gentle but firm, steering her through the crowd and up the steps to where the king waited. And with each step, her mind screamed at her to flee, even as her body continued obediently forward. Then she was standing on the platform, the entire assembled pack spread before her like a living sea, and the king was there beside her, real and solid, and unmistakably the same person she had talked with in the shadow of the cooper's shop. Up close, cleaned and properly dressed, he was even more striking than she had realized. His gray eyes keen with intelligence, his features strong and well-formed, his presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with his royal garments and everything to do with the force of personality that radiated from him. "Leora," he said, and his voice was soft enough that only she could hear it beneath the crowd's murmuring. "I'm sorry. I know this is difficult, but I need to do this publicly. Please trust me." She couldn't respond, couldn't force words past the constriction in her throat. All she could do was stand there, trembling slightly, wishing the ground would open and swallow her. Rowan turned back to the crowd, raising his hand for silence. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "exemplifies what I hope Frostmoor can become. She showed me that true nobility has nothing to do with birth or status, and everything to do with how we choose to treat one another when no one is watching or rewarding us for it." He reached into his robes and withdrew a small wooden box, opening it to reveal something that gleamed gold in the sunlight. "It is my honor and privilege to award Leora Hale the King's Compassion Medal, the highest civilian honor in Frostmoor, given only to those who embody the values our pack should hold most dear." "No," Leora's mind protested. This was wrong. She didn't deserve medals or honors. She had just shared some bread, had just talked with someone she thought was a fellow person struggling to survive. That wasn't heroic or exceptional. It was barely adequate. The minimum requirement of human decency. To elevate it to something deserving of royal recognition was to highlight how far society had fallen, how rare basic kindness had become. But Rowan was already lifting the medal from its box, was stepping close enough that she could smell the formal scent of whatever oil had been used to polish the leather of his robes, was placing the heavy golden medallion around her neck where it hung like an anchor, beautiful and entirely foreign against her plain dress. The crowd erupted into applause, uncertain at first, then building to something that might have been genuine or might have been the self-protective instinct to appear supportive of whatever the king endorsed. Leora stood frozen, the medal cold against her chest, and felt tears beginning to burn behind her eyes. This was a nightmare. She was being displayed like some curiosity. Her poverty and struggle turned into a public lesson. Her private act of kindness transformed into a spectacle for pack consumption. Worse, she was being positioned as somehow superior to all these people, being held up as an example in a way that would inevitably breed resentment from those who felt unfairly judged. Additionally, Rowan continued, and gods above, there was more. I am creating a new position within the palace administration. Leora Hale will serve as special advisor for lower district affairs, with full authority to bring concerns and recommendations directly to me. Her salary will be commensurate with other palace advisors, and she will have an official residence within the palace grounds, as befits her new station. The applause this time was more scattered, and Leora could hear the undercurrent of confusion and disapproval. An Omega from the lower district, elevated to palace advisor, given residence in the royal grounds? It was unprecedented, shocking, a violation of so many unspoken rules about how society was organized and who belonged where. She could practically feel the hostility beginning to coalesce among certain segments of the crowd. The existing advisors and their families who would resent her sudden elevation. The lower district residents who would see her as having betrayed her origins. The Omegas who would view her as a token being used to avoid real systemic change. I don't want this, Leora managed to whisper, the words barely audible even to herself. But Rowan either didn't hear or chose to ignore her, continuing his address to the crowd. This assembly marks the beginning of significant reforms in how Frostmoor operates. I will be establishing new laws protecting the most vulnerable in our pack, ensuring fair wages for all workers, regardless of their designation, creating oversight committees to investigate reports of abuse or exploitation, and restructuring the pack councils to include representation from all districts and all designations. The announcement of actual policy changes seemed to mollify some of the crowd's uncertainty about Leora's elevation. These were concrete reforms that would affect many people's lives, and the king was clearly serious about implementing them. Some faces in the crowd showed approval, others calculation as they considered how these changes might impact their own interests, still others naked anger at having their comfortable arrangements disrupted. Rowan spoke for another 10 minutes, outlining the specific reforms and the timeline for their implementation. Leora barely heard any of it, standing beside him in a fog of shock and growing horror as she processed what had just happened to her life. Everything she had known, every careful routine she had built, every strategy for survival she had developed, all of it had been torn away in a matter of minutes and replaced with something she had never wanted and was utterly unprepared for. When the address finally concluded, the crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, clearly hoping for further drama, or perhaps a chance to introduce themselves to the king. Rowan turned to Leora, his expression shifting from royal authority to something more uncertain, more human. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. "Please, will you come with me?" It wasn't really a request. She had no power to refuse a king, but the phrasing suggested he was at least trying to give her choice in the matter. Leora nodded mutely and allowed herself to be escorted by guards through the crowd and into a building adjacent to the square, up several flights of stairs, and finally into a private room that appeared to be some kind of administrative office with maps on the walls and a large desk cluttered with documents. The guards withdrew, closing the door behind them, and suddenly Leora was alone with Rowan, with the king, and all the careful distance that public spectacle had maintained evaporated in the silence. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form words, Leora's shock transformed into something sharper and more volatile. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and shaking with fury. "How dare you do that to me?" Rowan blinked, clearly taken aback by her anger. "Leora, I was honoring you. You were humiliating me," she interrupted. All the deference she should have shown to royalty burned away by the intensity of her emotions. "You paraded me in front of the entire pack like some kind of trained animal, held me up as an example without asking if I wanted that attention, announced decisions about my life without consulting me, and apparently think I should be grateful for it. That's not—" Rowan started, but Leora wasn't finished. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tears were flowing freely now, hot tracks down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. "I survived by being invisible, by not attracting notice or causing problems or standing out in any way. You've made that impossible. You've painted a target on me for everyone who resents your reforms, or who thinks I'm getting special treatment, or who just doesn't like seeing an Omega elevated above her proper place. And you did it without my permission, without even warning me, because it never occurred to you that I might have feelings about being used as a political prop in your reform agenda." Rowan's expression had shifted from surprised to stricken. "Leora, I didn't think—" "No, you didn't think," she said bitterly. "You thought about what served your purposes. You thought about the statement you wanted to make, and the reforms you wanted to implement. But you didn't think about me as an actual person with a life and concerns, and the right to make my own choices about my future." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Rowan stood frozen, clearly struggling to process her words, to reconcile his intentions with their impact. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier authority. "You're right," he said. "God's above. You're absolutely right. I was so focused on using the situation to drive change that I didn't consider what it would cost you personally. He ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration that was achingly familiar from their evening conversations. "I'm so sorry, Leora. I thought I was honoring you. But I was really just using you for my own purposes, just like everyone else uses people with less power. The admission deflated some of Leora's anger, leaving behind exhaustion and a kind of sick despair. "I can't be your advisor," she said flatly. "I don't know anything about palace politics or administration. I barely know how to read beyond what's necessary for bakery work. I'll be eaten alive by people who actually understand how these systems work." "I can teach you," Rowan said. "Or rather, we can hire tutors, provide you with education and resources and support." "That's not the point," Leora said, though even as she spoke she could feel her resistance weakening. What choice did she really have? The announcement had been public. Refusing the position now would be a rejection of the king's judgment, a slight that would have its own consequences. "The point is that you decided my future without asking me. You took away my agency while claiming to honor my choices. Don't you see the contradiction there?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was something raw in his voice. "During those 2 weeks we talked, I valued your company, your perspective, your honesty. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear, who calculate every interaction for maximum advantage, who see me as a position rather than a person. You were different. You talked to me like I was just Rowan, someone worth knowing for myself rather than what I could do for you. I wanted to repay that, to give you opportunities and resources and a better life. But I realize now that I was also being selfish. I wanted to keep you close, to continue having access to your honesty and perspective." The admission shifted something in the room's atmosphere, introducing a complication that Leora wasn't prepared to examine. "I don't want to be kept close like a pet advisor who tells you truths others won't," she said, but without the earlier heat. "If I'm going to do this, and apparently I have no real choice, then I need actual authority. I need you to listen when I bring concerns, even when they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. I need to be able to speak freely without fear that I'll lose my position if I disagree with you. And I need you to never, ever make major decisions about my life without discussing them with me first." "Agreed," Rowan said immediately. "All of it. You have my word as king, and more importantly, as the person who sat with you on those evenings and learned what it means to be seen. I'll do better. I'll be better." Leora studied him, trying to reconcile the beggar she had befriended with the king standing before her, trying to decide if she believed his promises or if she was simply rationalizing her lack of real options. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. "The disguise? The test? What were you hoping to find?" Rowan moved to the window, looking out over the square where the crowd had mostly dispersed. "My father ruled through fear and rigid tradition," he said quietly. "When I inherited the throne, I wanted to be different. I implemented reforms, tried to be fair, thought I was building a better realm. But I kept hearing reports that suggested the reality on the ground didn't match my intentions. Merchants exploiting workers, officials accepting bribes, systematic cruelty toward those with low status. I could have sent investigators, conducted formal inquiries, but I knew people would hide the truth from royal officials. I needed to see it unfiltered." "And what did you see?" Leora asked. "That good intentions from the top mean nothing if the culture itself is rotten," Rowan said. "That laws protecting omegas are useless if the people enforcing them don't believe omegas deserve protection. That I've been failing in ways I didn't even understand, because I've never experienced life from the perspective of those with no power." He turned back to face her. "You asked once why the system was organized to exclude omegas from councils and decisions. I gave you platitudes about control and insecurity. But the real answer is simpler and more damning. We exclude people because we can, because it serves the interests of those already in power, because changing it would require those with privilege to give some of it up, and very few people do that voluntarily. So you're going to force them," Leora said. "I'm going to try," Rowan corrected. "But I can't do it alone, and I can't do it without perspectives from people who've actually lived through the problems I'm trying to solve. That's why I need you, Leora. Not as a symbol or a token or a political prop, as a genuine partner in rebuilding Frostmoor into something better than what it's become." The words were pretty, perhaps even sincere. But Leora knew how little pretty words meant when confronted with entrenched power structures and people determined to maintain their advantages. "You'll face enormous resistance," she said. "The existing advisors will hate having me there. The upper district families will see these reforms as attacks on their interests. Even the lower district might turn on you if the changes don't come fast enough or go far enough." "I know," Rowan said. "That's why I need someone who will tell me the truth even when it's inconvenient. Someone who understands what actually matters to the people most affected by these policies." He paused, then added with something that might have been humor. "Also, someone who's not afraid to call me out when I'm being an arrogant idiot who makes decisions without considering their full impact." Despite everything, despite her anger and fear and the overwhelming disruption of her entire life, Leora felt a small smile tug at her lips. "You were very much an arrogant idiot today," she said. "I was," Rowan agreed. "I'm sorry, truly. If you want to refuse the position, I'll support that publicly. I'll say you declined the honor to continue your valuable work in the lower district, and I'll make sure no one bothers you about it." Leora considered this, trying to imagine returning to the bakery and her tiny back room, pretending none of this had happened. But she knew it was impossible. Her invisibility was gone, destroyed by those terrible minutes on the platform. People knew her name now, knew the king had singled her out, knew she had refused an opportunity others would kill for. She would be resented either way, whispered about either way, made into a symbol either way. At least as an advisor, she might actually be able to help people, rather than simply returning to survival mode. Chapter The Beggar King. Part 4. "I'll do it," Leora said finally, the words feeling both like surrender and defiance. "But on my terms. I want weekly meetings where I can speak freely about what I'm seeing and hearing from the lower districts. I want authority to investigate complaints without having to get approval from other advisors first. And I want it made clear to everyone that I'm not your pet project or your proof that the system works. I'm there to represent people who have never had representation before." Rowan nodded, and something in his expression suggested relief mixed with respect. "Done. All of it. I'll have the formal appointments drawn up with those specifications included. You'll report directly to me, with no intermediary authorities who can block or dilute your work." "When do I start?" Leora asked, and felt a wave of vertigo at the question. Yesterday, she had been a baker's assistant. Today, she was apparently a palace advisor. The speed of the transformation was nauseating. "You'll need time to transition," Rowan said. "I'm not going to throw you into council meetings tomorrow with no preparation. We'll start with settling you into your quarters, arranging for tutors to help you develop the skills you'll need, introducing you gradually to how palace administration works. A month, perhaps, before you begin formally attending councils and taking on official duties." A month? It sounded simultaneously too long and nowhere near long enough. But Leora nodded acceptance, too exhausted by the day's emotional upheaval to argue further. "I need to go back to Millbrook," she said, "to get my things and tell Margaret what's happening. She deserves to hear it from me, not from gossip." "Of course," Rowan agreed immediately. "I'll have guards escort you." "No," Leora interrupted firmly. "No guards. I'll go alone. If I show up with royal escorts, it will only make things worse. People need to see that I'm still myself, not suddenly too important to walk my own streets." Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but seemed to catch himself. "You're right. But please, take this at least." He pulled a small card from his desk and wrote something on it quickly. "If anyone gives you trouble, show them this. It bears my personal seal and grants you safe passage anywhere in Frostmoor." Leora took the card, studying the elaborate seal pressed into wax at the bottom. It felt surreal, holding something that represented the king's personal authority. "Thank you," she said quietly. The walk back to Millbrook felt longer than the journey to the square had been. Leora moved through streets that should have been familiar, but now seemed changed, as if her elevation had altered not just her own status, but the very geography she navigated. People stared as she passed, whispering to each other, and she realized the medal still hung around her neck, marking her as clearly as if she wore a sign declaring her the king's chosen example. She tucked it inside her dress, wanting to hide it, but the weight remained against her chest like a brand. By the time she reached the bakery, news had clearly spread ahead of her. A small crowd had gathered outside, and they fell silent as she approached, watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Margaret stood in the bakery doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Inside," she said shortly, and Leora hurried past the watching crowd into the familiar warmth of the shop. Margaret followed, closing the door firmly behind them and drawing the curtain across the window to block prying eyes. "Well," the baker said, turning to face Leora, "that was quite a show." "I didn't want it," Leora said immediately. "I didn't ask for any of it. He just did it, without warning, without asking." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "I believe you. You're many things, Leora, but calculating isn't one of them. If you'd been trying to seduce your way to power, you'd have done a better job of it." She moved to the work table and began absently wiping it down, though it was already clean. "So what happens now? You're leaving, I assume." "I have to," Leora said, and was surprised by the lump that formed in her throat. "He's created a position for me. I can't refuse it without insulting him publicly, and that would have consequences worse than accepting." "Palace advisor," Margaret said, shaking her head. "From orphan to royal advisor in 2 weeks. It's like something out of a children's tale, except those usually end with everyone living happily ever after. And I doubt that's how this works in reality." "It's not," Leora agreed. "The existing advisors will hate me. The upper district families will see me as an upstart who needs to be put back in her place. Even people here will resent me for leaving, for appearing to think I'm better than them now." "Some will," Margaret acknowledged. "But not everyone. Some will be glad to finally have someone in the palace who understands what life is actually like for ordinary people." She set down her cloth and looked directly at Leora. "You didn't ask for my advice, but I'm giving it anyway. Don't try to be someone you're not. Don't let them polish away all the rough edges that make you who you are. The moment you start talking and acting like them, you become useless to the people you're supposed to represent." The words settled into Leora's chest, solid and grounding. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For giving me work when I had nothing. For not asking questions about where I came from or what I was running from. For teaching me how to survive." Margaret's expression softened slightly, though she waved off the gratitude with characteristic gruffness. "You earned your keep. Best worker I ever had. Even if you did insist on feeding beggars with your supper." She paused, then added, "He seemed genuinely sorry, up there on the platform, when you looked angry. That's something, I suppose." "He apologized after," Leora admitted. "Said I was right to call him out for making decisions about my life without asking me first." "A king who can admit when he's wrong," Margaret mused. "That's rarer than it should be. Maybe this won't be a complete disaster after all." She moved toward the back room. "Come on, let's get your things together. Not that you have much to pack." She was right. Leora's possessions fit easily into a single cloth bag. 2 dresses besides the one she wore, both as patched and faded as the first. A comb with several teeth missing. A small knife she used for cutting bread and thread. A wooden cup that had been her mother's, the only thing she had managed to keep from her childhood. She held this last item for a moment, running her fingers over the worn wood, wondering what her mother would think of what had happened today. "She'd be proud of you," Margaret said quietly from the doorway, as if reading her thoughts. "Not for the position or the medal, for staying kind despite everything that tried to harden you. That's the real accomplishment, Leora. Don't lose it." Leora nodded, not trusting herself to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and tucked the cup carefully into her bag. When she turned back, Margaret was holding out a small purse that clinked with the sound of coins. "Your wages," the baker said. "Through the end of the month, plus a bonus for all the extra festival hours. You earned it." "Margaret, I can't." "You can and you will," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I don't care if you're about to be living in a palace. That's your money, honestly earned. Don't insult me by refusing it." Leora took the purse, its weight substantial in her hand. More money than she had ever held at once, probably more than she would have earned in 6 months of normal work. "Thank you," she whispered. The goodbye was awkward, neither of them comfortable with emotional displays, but Margaret pulled her into a brief, fierce hug before stepping back quickly. "Go on then," she said, her voice gruff. "Don't keep royalty waiting." "And Leora? Come visit sometimes." Not the palace advisor visiting her former workplace. Just Leora, stopping by for bread and conversation. "I will," Leora promised, though they both knew it was more hope than certainty. The distance between them was already growing, invisible but inexorable, the natural result of her changed circumstances. The walk back to the upper district was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. People had gathered in small clusters, clearly discussing the day's events, and they fell silent as Leora passed, watching her with open curiosity and varying degrees of hostility. She kept her eyes forward and walked quickly, clutching her bag and trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. By the time she reached the palace gates, her nerves were stretched thin and her legs ached from the quick pace. The guards recognized her immediately. Word had clearly spread among the palace staff, and they opened the gates with formal efficiency, directing her to wait in a receiving area while someone fetched the king's steward. The receiving area was more luxurious than anywhere Leora had ever been. The floors were polished marble, the walls hung with tapestries depicting historical battles and courtly scenes, the furniture carved from dark wood and upholstered in rich fabrics. She stood in the center of the room, afraid to sit on anything that looked so expensive, and tried not to feel like an intruder in a space clearly not designed for people like her. The steward, when he arrived, was a tall beta man with silver gray hair and an expression of professional neutrality that probably hid significant personal opinions about the day's developments. "Miss Hale," he said with a slight bow that felt more like formality than respect. "I am Aldrich, the king's head steward. His Majesty has instructed me to show you to your quarters and ensure you have everything you need." "Thank you," Leora said, and winced at how small her voice sounded in the grand space. Aldrich led her through a maze of corridors, each more elaborate than the last. Servants moved efficiently through the halls, carrying linens and trays and various items Leora couldn't identify, and they all stopped to stare as she passed. She could practically feel their judgment. This bedraggled lower district Omega in her patched dress, being escorted to private quarters like she belonged here. The rooms Aldrich finally showed her to were located in the east wing of the palace, in a section he explained was reserved for high-ranking advisors and visiting dignitaries. He opened a door to reveal a suite that was larger than the entire bakery where she had spent the last 11 years of her life. "The sitting room," Aldrich announced, gesturing to a space furnished with comfortable chairs, a writing desk, and bookshelves that lined one entire wall. "Through there is the bedchamber, and beyond that a private bathing room with heated water. The wardrobe has been stocked with appropriate clothing in your size, though you'll need to meet with the palace seamstress tomorrow for proper fittings. Meals can be taken in the common dining hall or delivered here, as you prefer. If you require anything, pull this cord and a servant will attend you." He delivered this information in the same neutral tone he might use to describe the weather, but Leora could hear the undercurrent of disapproval. This man had probably served the palace for decades, had worked his way up through the ranks to his current prestigious position, and now he was being told to cater to an Omega from the lower district who had done nothing to earn such treatment beyond sharing some bread. "Thank you, Aldrich," Leora said, trying to match his formality. "I appreciate your assistance." He bowed again, that same shallow gesture that looked like respect, but felt like its opposite. "His Majesty requests your presence for dinner this evening, if you are agreeable. 7 o'clock in the private dining room. I will send someone to escort you." Then he withdrew, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like judgment. Alone in the overwhelming luxury of her new quarters, Leora set down her pitiful cloth bag and tried to process the complete transformation of her circumstances. This morning she had woken in a room barely large enough to lie down in, with gaps in the walls that let in cold drafts and the constant smell of yeast from the bakery below. Now she stood in a space that could have housed 6 families comfortably, surrounded by possessions that represented more wealth than she would have earned in a lifetime of labor. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching things tentatively as if they might disappear if she pressed too hard. The bed in the sleeping chamber was enormous, piled with pillows and covered in blankets that felt like touching clouds. The bathing room contained an actual tub large enough to submerge in, with metal fixtures that apparently delivered heated water through some mechanism she didn't understand. The wardrobe Aldrich had mentioned held dresses and fabrics she had only ever seen on wealthy women, silk and fine wool and linen so smooth it felt like water. It was all beautiful and terrifying and completely alien. Leora sank into one of the sitting room chairs and felt hot tears begin to slide down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from happiness or gratitude. She was crying from the sheer overwhelming weight of displacement, from the loss of everything familiar, from the terror of being thrust into a world where she had no idea how to navigate or survive. She had spent 19 years learning the rules of poverty, how to stretch meager resources, how to make herself invisible to avoid trouble, how to find safety in the margins of society. Those skills were useless here. Worse than useless, they marked her as fundamentally other, someone who didn't belong no matter what title or position had been imposed upon her. The knock on the door startled her, and she quickly wiped her face, trying to compose herself. "Come in," she called, her voice unsteady. The door opened to reveal a young woman, probably a few years older than Leora, dressed in servant's clothing. She carried a tray with tea and small cakes, and her expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested she had been specifically instructed on how to behave. "Begging your pardon, miss," she said with a small curtsy. "I'm Clara, assigned to attend you. I thought you might like some refreshment after the day's events." "Thank you," Leora said, gesturing toward the small table near the window. "Please, set it there." Clara did so efficiently, then turned back with a slight smile that seemed more genuine than Aldrich's professional courtesy. "If I may say so, miss, that was quite something today. The whole palace is talking about it. Some good, some less good. But I wanted you to know that not everyone here thinks you don't deserve this opportunity." The kindness in her voice broke through something in Leora's fragile composure. "Thank you, Clara," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." The servant nodded. "I grew up in the lower district myself, though I've worked here for 5 years now. It's not easy, crossing those boundaries. People will test you, try to make you feel like you don't belong. But the king chose you for a reason. And from what I heard, it was a good reason. Don't let them grind you down." After Clara left, Leora poured herself tea with shaking hands and sat by the window, looking out over the palace grounds. The gardens below were immaculately maintained, with carved hedges and flower beds arranged in geometric patterns. Beyond the walls, she could see the upper district's roof lines, and beyond that, if she looked carefully, the hazy outline of the lower district where she had spent her entire life. The distance between here and there was not measured in miles, but in gulfs of privilege and power that people like her were never supposed to cross. Yet here she was, pulled across that gulf by the whim of a king who had disguised himself as a beggar and decided her simple kindness deserved to be transformed into a political statement. She thought about Rowan's words in that office after the assembly, about him valuing her honesty, her perspective, her willingness to see him as a person rather than a position. There had been something in his voice when he spoke about their evening conversations, something that suggested his feelings about her might be more complicated than simple appreciation for an advisor's candor. The possibility both intrigued and terrified her. She had no experience with attraction or courtship. Her life had been too consumed by survival to leave room for such things. The few times men had shown interest in her, it had been the kind of interest that saw her as easy prey rather than a person worth knowing. She had learned to deflect such attention, to remain unremarkable and undesirable as a form of protection. But Rowan was different. He had seen her at her most ordinary, her most tired, her most unglamorous, and had apparently found something worth valuing anyway. Not because of how she looked or what she could offer, but because of who she was when she thought no one important was watching. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Clara returned to announce that someone had arrived to escort her to dinner with the king. Leora's stomach clenched with fresh anxiety. She had been too nervous to eat any of the cakes, and the tea sat heavy and acidic in her empty stomach. But refusing dinner with the king was not an option, so she smoothed her dress as best she could and followed Clara's directions to the private dining room. The escort turned out to be a palace guard, young and uncomfortable looking in his formal armor. He led her through more corridors, these ones quieter than the earlier routes, until they reached a door guarded by 2 additional soldiers. These men opened the door without comment, and Leora stepped through into a room that was surprisingly modest compared to the rest of the palace. The dining room was small and clearly intended for intimate gatherings rather than formal state dinners. A single table occupied the center, set for 2 people, and Rowan stood by the window, still dressed in his formal robes from the assembly, though he had removed several of the more elaborate layers. He turned as she entered, and his expression shifted from preoccupation to something that might have been relief. "Leora," he said, moving toward her. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "You're the king," Leora said. "Refusing your dinner invitation would be unwise." Something pained crossed his face. "I suppose that's true, but I hoped you might come as a friend rather than as a subject compelled by rank." "I'm not sure we can be friends anymore," Leora said quietly. "Not when there's such an imbalance of power between us. Friends are equals. We're not." Rowan was silent for a moment, then gestured toward the table. "Will you sit anyway? Please? I promise the food is excellent, and we should at least eat while we discuss impossible questions about power and friendship." Despite everything, Leora felt a small smile tug at her lips. There was something of the beggar Rowan in that response, the self-deprecating humor that had made their conversations easy. She moved to the table and sat, trying not to be overwhelmed by the array of dishes already laid out. More food than she typically saw in a week, all of it beautifully prepared and artfully arranged. Rowan sat across from her and began serving food onto her plate, an oddly domestic gesture that felt strange coming from a king. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, "about me taking away your agency while claiming to honor your choices. You were right. I was thinking like a king, seeing a problem and implementing a solution without considering that the solution itself might be part of the problem. I'm still angry about it," Leora said, picking up her fork and examining the unfamiliar food. "But I also understand why you did it. You wanted to make a statement, show that things were changing. I just wish you'd found a way to do that without making me the centerpiece of the demonstration." "I couldn't," Rowan said simply, "because you were the point. Not as a symbol, but as a specific person who showed me something I needed to learn. Honoring you publicly wasn't just about sending a message to the pack, it was about acknowledging a debt I owe you personally." "You don't owe me anything," Leora protested. "I shared some bread. That's not worth—" She gestured at the room, at the palace beyond, at the entire situation. All of this. "It was worth everything," Rowan said. And there was such intensity in his voice that Leora looked up sharply, meeting his gray eyes across the table. "You saved my life, Leora. Not physically, though. Who knows how long I would have survived out there without the food you shared. But you saved something more important. My ability to see people as people, rather than statistics or political considerations. I was becoming exactly what I swore I would never be. A ruler so removed from his people's actual lives that good intentions meant nothing. You pulled me back from that edge." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Leora wasn't sure she wanted to examine too closely. She took a bite of food, some kind of roasted meat in rich sauce, and tried to focus on the practical rather than the emotional. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the reforms you announced, with my position, with all of it." Rowan seemed to accept the change of subject, though something in his expression suggested the previous conversation was merely postponed, not concluded. "The reforms will take time to implement," he said. "I've made enemies today among people who benefit from the current system. They'll resist, try to undermine the changes, look for ways to maintain their advantages while appearing to comply. Your job will be to help me see past the performance to what's actually happening on the ground." "And if what I see contradicts what your other advisors tell you?" Leora asked. "Then we'll investigate further and determine who's telling the truth," Rowan said. "I trust you, Leora. You have no reason to lie to me." No agenda beyond wanting to improve conditions for people like yourself. That makes your perspective invaluable. The Beggar King. Part 5. The first month in the palace passed in a blur of lessons and adjustments that left Leora exhausted in entirely new ways. Physical labor, she understood. The ache of overworked muscles. The bone-deep tiredness that came from 14-hour days. But this mental and emotional exhaustion was different, more insidious, harder to recover from during the brief hours she allowed herself for sleep. Her days began with reading lessons from a patient tutor named Master Edwin, an elderly beta scholar who showed no visible disdain for teaching an omega, who could barely sound out words longer than 2 syllables. He started with children's primers, which should have been humiliating but somehow wasn't, perhaps because Edwin treated the material with the same seriousness he would give advanced texts. Within 2 weeks, Leora could read simple sentences. Within 3, she was struggling through basic administrative documents. It was slow, frustrating work, but also deeply satisfying in a way she hadn't anticipated. Afternoons were devoted to learning palace protocol and administrative procedures from Aldrich, who remained professionally courteous while making it clear through 1,000 subtle signals that he considered her presence an unfortunate necessity to be endured. He taught her how to navigate the Byzantine hierarchies of palace staff, which council members held real power versus those with merely ceremonial titles, and the unwritten rules that governed interaction between different ranks and designations. You will be expected to show deference to the senior advisors, Aldrich explained one afternoon as they reviewed seating arrangements for council meetings. Not because they outrank you officially. His Majesty has made clear you report directly to him, but because maintaining harmony requires acknowledging their experience and status. Even when they're wrong? Leora asked. Aldrich's expression remained neutral. Especially then. Direct contradiction will only make enemies. You must learn to challenge diplomatically, to phrase disagreement as questions rather than statements, to let them believe they've arrived at your conclusions themselves. It was exhausting, this constant calculation of how to speak and act, but Leora absorbed the lessons because she understood their necessity. She was fighting an uphill battle for legitimacy, and every misstep would be used as evidence that she didn't belong. The other advisors had made their feelings clear through pointed exclusions from informal gatherings, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, and a steady stream of subtle slights that individually meant nothing but cumulatively created an atmosphere of hostility. The worst was Lord Garrett, the senior Alpha advisor who had served under the previous king and clearly resented Rowan's reforms. He never challenged Leora directly, that would be too obvious, but he had perfected the art of dismissing her through strategic inattention. When she spoke in meetings, he would busy himself with documents, responding to her points with patronizing patience, as if humoring a child who didn't understand adult conversations. The lower district housing situation requires immediate attention, Leora said during her 3rd council meeting, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The buildings are structurally unsound. We've had 2 collapses in the past month alone, and winter's coming. People are going to freeze in structures that can't keep out the cold. Yes, the housing is always in need of repair, Lord Garrett said without looking up from his papers. But we must prioritize expenditures carefully, perhaps in the spring when funds are less constrained. People will die before spring, Leora said, frustration breaking through her diplomatic training. People die every winter, Garrett replied with casual cruelty. It's unfortunate, but resources are finite. We cannot save everyone. Rowan, who had been listening quietly from his position at the head of the table, finally spoke. Lord Garrett, how much did we spend last month on the decorative fountains for the Upper District Square? Garrett looked up, clearly not expecting the question. That was a previously approved project, Your Majesty. Already budgeted and contracted. How much? Rowan repeated. Approximately 15,000 gold sovereigns, Garrett admitted reluctantly. And how much would it cost to make the most critical repairs to lower district housing? Rowan asked Leora. She had done the research, had spent hours going over building assessments with the few city inspectors who actually bothered to survey lower district structures. 8,000 gold sovereigns would address the structures in immediate danger of collapse, she said. 20,000 would do comprehensive repairs that would last through winter. Then reallocate the fountain funds, Rowan said firmly. The upper district can admire their existing decorations for another year. People's lives take precedence over aesthetic improvements. The satisfaction Leora felt at Garrett's barely concealed fury was petty, but deeply gratifying. Small victories like this sustained her through the constant battles, the endless resistance to every proposal she made, the exhausting work of proving herself capable to people determined to see her as nothing more than the king's charity case. But there were also unexpected allies. Clara, her assigned servant, became something like a friend, sharing palace gossip and offering advice on navigating social minefields. Master Edwin seemed genuinely pleased with her progress in reading and began bringing her books beyond the required administrative texts, histories and philosophies that opened worlds she had never known existed. And there was a younger advisor, a beta woman named Serena who specialized in trade policy, who went out of her way to include Leora in discussions and defend her proposals when others tried to dismiss them. "Don't let Garrett intimidate you," Serena said one evening when they found themselves working late in the administrative offices. "He treats everyone who isn't an alpha male as inherently inferior. It's not personal, though I'm sure it feels that way." "Does it get easier?" Leora asked, rubbing her tired eyes as she struggled through another report. "Eventually," Serena said. "Once you've proven yourself enough times that they can't dismiss you as a fluke or a novelty. Give it 6 months, a year at most, then you'll just be another advisor rather than the king's pet project." But Leora wasn't sure she had 6 months. The strain of maintaining constant vigilance, of measuring every word and gesture, of enduring the subtle and not-so-subtle hostility, was wearing her down in ways that worried her. She found herself snapping at Clara over trivial matters, struggling to focus during lessons, lying awake at night reviewing every interaction for mistakes that might be used against her. Rowan noticed. Of course he noticed. Despite his royal responsibilities, he seemed to pay careful attention to her well-being in a way that both comforted and unsettled her. They had dinner together twice a week, private meals where they could talk honestly without the performance required in council meetings. These evenings had become something Leora looked forward to despite herself, a respite from the constant pressure of proving her worth. "You look exhausted," Rowan said bluntly one evening about 6 weeks after her elevation to advisor. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough," Leora lied, pushing food around her plate without eating much. "Leora?" His voice was gentle but firm. "I can see the shadows under your eyes. You're driving yourself too hard." "I have to," she said, setting down her fork. "Every mistake I make is evidence that I don't belong here. Every time I stumble over a word while reading or miss some protocol nuance or fail to understand a reference everyone else gets, it confirms what they all think, that you made a sentimental error in elevating me." "I don't care what they think," Rowan said. "I care what you think. I care that you're running yourself into the ground trying to meet impossible standards." "The standards aren't impossible," Leora countered. "They're just different from anything I've known before, and I can meet them if I work hard enough. I just need time." "At what cost?" Rowan asked. "Leora, I didn't bring you here to break yourself trying to become someone else. I brought you here because of who you already are, someone with integrity and compassion and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Those qualities don't require you to transform into a perfect courtier who never makes mistakes." "Those qualities aren't enough," Leora said bitterly. "Not in this world. Compassion without competence is useless. Integrity without the skills to navigate palace politics means nothing. I have to be more than just the kind Omega who shared bread with a beggar. I have to be actually good at this job, or everything you're trying to achieve through these reforms will fail." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he stood and moved around the table to kneel beside her chair, bringing them to eye level. The gesture was so unexpected, so against every protocol of how kings and subjects should interact, that Leora froze. "Listen to me," Rowan said, his voice low and intense. "You are already good at this job, better than advisors who've held their positions for decades. Do you know how I know? Because in 6 weeks, you've identified problems that others have been ignoring for years. You've proposed solutions that are practical and effective rather than theoretically elegant, but useless in implementation. You've made me see my own realm through new eyes and forced me to confront failures I was blind to. That's not the work of someone inadequate. It's the work of someone extraordinary. I can barely read, Leora whispered. I don't know history or law or economics or any of the things the other advisors studied for years. How can I possibly be effective when I'm missing so much foundational knowledge? Because you have something they don't, Rowan said. You've lived the reality that all their theoretical knowledge is supposed to address. You know what it's like to be cold and hungry and afraid, to be overlooked and dismissed and treated as if your life has no value. That lived experience is worth more than a dozen university degrees. The knowledge they have can be taught. The perspective you bring is irreplaceable. Tears were sliding down Leora's cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. I'm so tired, she admitted. I thought poverty was exhausting, but this is worse. At least when I was poor, I knew the rules. Here, I'm constantly afraid of making some mistake that will humiliate you, or undermine your reforms, or prove that I really am just a foolish Omega who doesn't belong. Rowan reached up and gently wiped her tears with his thumb, the gesture achingly tender. You belong here, he said firmly. Not because I declared it, but because you've earned it. Every meeting you attend, every report you write, every time you challenge assumptions and force us to think differently, you're proving you belong. The only person who doubts that is you, and Lord Garrett, and half the other advisors. And probably most of the palace staff, Leora said, but with a watery attempt at humor. Lord Garrett doubts everyone who isn't himself, Rowan said, a hint of amusement in his voice. His opinion on your worth is meaningless, and the others will come around once they've seen you work long enough to overcome their initial prejudices. But none of that matters if you've destroyed yourself trying to meet their standards. I need you healthy and whole, Leora, not burned out and broken. There was something in the way he said her name, in how his hand lingered against her cheek, that made Leora's breath catch. The air between them felt suddenly charged with possibilities that had nothing to do with advisory positions or palace politics. She should pull back, re-establish the professional distance that was supposed to exist between king and advisor. But she found herself leaning into his touch instead, seeking the comfort of physical connection after weeks of careful isolation. Rowan, she said softly, using his name rather than his title for the first time since learning his true identity. What are we doing? I don't know, he admitted, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I told myself I brought you here solely for your advisory capabilities, that my interest was purely professional, but I've been lying to myself, and probably to you as well. We can't, Leora said, but without conviction. The power imbalance? The impossibility of real consent when you're the king and I'm an advisor I cannot afford to lose, Rowan interrupted. Which means I cannot pursue this, cannot act on feelings that would compromise your position or make you feel obligated to respond in ways you might not genuinely feel. I know this. I've been telling myself this every day for 6 weeks. It doesn't make the feelings less real. Leora's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. What if the feelings aren't one-sided? She whispered. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they burned with an intensity that stole her breath. Then we face an impossible situation, he said, because I refuse to be a king who uses his power to pressure someone dependent on him for status and security. And you deserve to choose freely, without the weight of royal authority influencing your decisions. So what do we do? Leora asked. We wait, Rowan said, and the regret in his voice was palpable. We maintain professional boundaries. We let you establish yourself fully in your position. Prove to yourself and everyone else that you belong here independent of my personal feelings. And if, after you're secure and certain of your own power, you still feel something for me, if this is real and not just gratitude or confusion or the strange intensity of our first meetings, then we can revisit this conversation. It was the right answer, the ethical answer, the only answer that respected her autonomy and didn't exploit the vast difference in their positions. Leora knew this intellectually, even as every emotional impulse screamed at her to close the distance between them, to lean forward and kiss him, to reach for something that might be love, or might be the desperate need for human connection after years of isolation. Instead, she nodded slowly. "You're right," she said, her voice unsteady. "We should wait. I need to know who I am in this new life before I can know what I genuinely feel versus what I'm projecting onto you because you showed me kindness when I needed it most." Rowan stood, putting physical distance between them that felt like a physical ache. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "what I feel isn't based on gratitude or projection. I think I started falling for you the first night you shared your bread, when you treated a filthy stranger with more dignity than most people show their friends. Everything since then has only confirmed what I sensed in that moment, that you're extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with status or beauty or any of the things courts usually value." "Don't," Leora said, standing as well and wrapping her arms around herself. "Don't say things like that when we've just agreed to maintain boundaries. It makes this harder than it already is. You're right. I'm sorry." Rowan moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "But Leora, please take care of yourself. Let yourself rest. Accept that you don't have to be perfect to be valuable. And know that whatever happens between us personally, I will always be grateful for what you've given me, the ability to see my realm and my responsibilities clearly again." After he left, Leora sank back into her chair and let herself cry properly. Messy, ugly crying that she had been suppressing for weeks. She cried for her lost simplicity, for the impossibility of returning to invisibility, for the terrifying hope that maybe, somehow, she could build something meaningful in this new life. And she cried for the wanting she had discovered tonight, the aching desire for connection with someone who saw her fully and valued what he saw. The weeks that followed took on a different quality. Leora threw herself into her work with renewed focus, but this time she took Rowan's advice and allowed herself to be human, to ask for help when she needed it, to admit when she didn't understand something, to take breaks when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. And gradually, slowly, she began to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who genuinely belonged in the spaces she occupied. The reforms Rowan had announced began to take shape. New laws protecting Omega rights moved through the council, over Lord Garrett's objections, and were implemented with careful oversight to ensure compliance. The housing repairs were completed before winter truly set in, saving lives that would have been lost to cold and structural collapse. Wage standards were established and enforced, and oversight committees began investigating reports of exploitation and abuse. None of it went smoothly. There was resistance at every step, from the blatant opposition of those like Lord Garrett who saw their privileges threatened, to the more subtle resistance of bureaucrats who implemented changes with deliberate inefficiency. But Leora found that her unique position, her background in the lower district combined with her new authority, allowed her to identify and address resistance in ways the other advisors couldn't. She also discovered she had a talent for administration, the skills that had allowed her to survive poverty: careful resource management, attention to detail, ability to see practical problems in theoretical plans, translated surprisingly well to policy work. By her third month as advisor, even Lord Garrett had stopped openly dismissing her proposals, though his hostility remained barely concealed beneath a veneer of civility. And throughout it all, Rowan kept his promise. Their relationship remained professional during meetings and formal occasions, though their private dinners continued. These evenings became opportunities for honest conversation about the challenges they faced, the resistance they encountered, and the small victories that kept them moving forward. The attraction between them remained, unspoken but palpable, but they maintained the boundaries they had agreed upon. 6 months after her elevation, Leora stood before the full council presenting a comprehensive review of the reform's implementation and their measurable impacts on lower district welfare. She had spent weeks preparing the report, working with Master Edwin to ensure her writing was clear and professional, consulting with Serena on economic data, even grudgingly accepting advice from Aldrich on how to frame her findings for maximum diplomatic impact. The housing repairs have resulted in a 63% reduction in winter mortality in the lower districts, she reported, her voice steady and confident. The new wage standards have increased average Omega income by 40%, which has had ripple effects throughout the local economy as people have more resources to spend. And the oversight committees have investigated 72 complaints of abuse or exploitation, resulting in sanctions against 17 businesses and 2 minor officials. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each council member. These numbers represent real lives improved, real suffering reduced. But they also represent only the beginning. There's still significant work to be done in education access, healthcare availability, and legal representation for those who can't afford private advocates. I have detailed proposals for addressing these issues, which I'm submitting for your review. The council discussed her report for over an hour, asking questions she was prepared to answer, raising objections she had anticipated and could address with data. By the end, even Lord Garrett acknowledged, through gritted teeth, that her work was thorough and her proposals merit serious consideration. After the meeting, as the council members filed out, Rowan caught her eye and gestured for her to remain. When they were alone, he smiled at her with unmistakable pride. "That was exceptional," he said. "You've completely silenced the doubters." "I wouldn't say completely," Leora replied, but she was smiling too. "Lord Garrett looked like he was swallowing glass every time he had to agree with one of my points." "Lord Garrett always looks like that," Rowan said. "It's his natural expression. But even he couldn't deny the strength of your work. You've proven yourself beyond any reasonable doubt, Leora. You belong here not because I declared it, but because you've made yourself indispensable." The pride in his voice warmed something deep in her chest. "I couldn't have done it without your support," she said. "Without you protecting me from the worst of the resistance while I found my footing." "You would have succeeded regardless," Rowan said, "though perhaps I made it slightly less arduous." He paused, then added carefully, "It's been 6 months." Leora's heart skipped. "It has. You've established yourself as a respected advisor. You have your own power now, independent of my favor. The other council members listen to you because your work is excellent, not because I appointed you. Which means," he trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them, "which means the power imbalance has shifted." Leora finished quietly. "I'm no longer entirely dependent on your approval for my position or security." "No, you're not," Rowan confirmed. "Which means we can have a conversation I've been waiting 6 months to have, if you want to have it." Leora took a breath, examining her own feelings with the honesty she had learned to bring to all her work. Did she still feel something for him? Or had 6 months of professional distance and personal growth changed what she felt into something else? But no, the attraction was still there, stronger even than before because it was now built on genuine respect and partnership, rather than the intensity of their initial connection. She had seen him be wrong and admit it, seen him struggle with difficult decisions, seen him angry and frustrated and vulnerable, and she had seen him consistently choose integrity over convenience, compassion over political expediency, growth over defending his ego. "I want to have it," she said simply. The smile that broke across Rowan's face was transformative, stripping away years of royal reserve to reveal genuine joy. "Then perhaps you would join me for dinner tonight. Not as advisor and king, but as Leora and Rowan, the 2 people who met over shared bread and honest conversation." "I would like that very much," Leora said, and felt a flutter of nervous excitement that was entirely different from the anxiety that had characterized her first months in the palace. That evening, they met in the small private dining room that had become their customary space, but the atmosphere was different, charged with possibility rather than careful restraint. They talked as they always did, but beneath the conversation about policy and reform ran a current of awareness, of attraction finally acknowledged and allowed space to exist. "I need to be honest with you," Rowan said eventually, setting down his wine glass, "about what this would mean if we pursue it. I'm the Alpha King. Any relationship I enter into, especially with an advisor, will be scrutinized and criticized. People will say I'm showing you favoritism, that your position is based on personal rather than professional factors. It will be difficult, Leora. Perhaps more difficult than what you've already endured. I know, Leora said, but I've learned something these past 6 months. Difficult doesn't mean impossible. And sometimes the things most worth having require us to fight for them. You're certain? Rowan asked. Because once we begin this, there's no going back to what we were before. Even if it doesn't work out, even if we discover we're better as friends and colleagues, we'll have crossed a line that will change everything. Leora thought about it, really thought about it, examining the question from every angle with the analytical skills she had developed over months of policy work. Yes, there would be complications. Yes, people would judge and criticize. Yes, her position would come under renewed scrutiny from those looking for any excuse to undermine her. But when she weighed those costs against the possibility of genuine connection with someone who saw her fully and valued what he saw, the choice was clear. I'm certain, she said. I know who I am now, independent of you. I know my own worth and capability. Whatever happens between us personally won't change that. I won't let it. Rowan stood and moved around the table, offering his hand. Then would you do me the honor of accompanying me on a walk through the gardens? As my friend, my advisor, and perhaps, if you're willing, something more. Leora took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers, and stood. I would be honored, Your Majesty. Just Rowan, he said softly. When we're alone like this, I'm just Rowan. The person you met in the streets of Millbrook and treated with kindness when you had every reason to protect what little you possessed. Just Rowan, Leora agreed, and let him lead her into the gardens where moonlight painted everything in silver, and the future stretched ahead full of possibility and challenge in equal measure. 3 years later, Leora stood in those same gardens preparing for a ceremony that would bind her life to Rowan's officially and permanently. The journey from Omega Baker's assistant to Queen Consort had been exactly as difficult as Rowan had warned, filled with political machinations, social prejudice, and constant battles to prove her worth to those who believed status should be determined by birth rather than merit. But she had survived every challenge, grown stronger with each obstacle, and gradually built a body of work that spoke louder than any criticism. The lower district reforms had expanded to include education initiatives, healthcare clinics, and legal advocacy programs. Omega rights had been strengthened and protected through legislation that was actively enforced. And the culture of Frostmoor had begun to shift, slowly but measurably, toward a society that valued compassion alongside strength. Lord Garrett had eventually resigned in protest, unable to accept the direction the realm was moving. But others, including Serena, who had become one of Leora's closest friends, had stepped into leadership roles and continued pushing for progressive change. The palace itself had become a place where merit mattered more than designation, where ideas were judged on their strength rather than the status of who proposed them. As Clara adjusted the final details of her wedding dress, elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting Leora's persistent refusal to completely abandon her roots, Leora thought about the beggar who had stood across from the bakery 3 years ago. She thought about the half loaf of bread that had changed both their lives, about the conversations that had planted seeds of transformation, about the moment on the platform when her life had been turned upside down. "Ready?" Clara asked, stepping back to admire her work. Leora looked at herself in the mirror. She was still herself, the same person who had scraped by on scraps and exhausting labor. But she was also someone new, someone who had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, someone who had learned that worth wasn't determined by birth or poverty, or the judgments of those too comfortable to imagine different possibilities. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The ceremony was witnessed by the entire pack, as royal bondings always were, but this time the crowd included significant representation from the lower districts, people whose lives had been tangibly improved by the reforms she had helped implement. As Rowan took her hand and spoke the traditional bonding vows, Leora saw Margaret in the crowd. The baker's face creased with a rare smile, and felt tears prick her eyes. When it was her turn to speak, Leora abandoned the formal script she had been given and spoke from her heart. 3 years ago, I shared bread with a stranger because it seemed like the right thing to do. I had no idea that simple act of basic human decency would lead to this moment, to this life, to the opportunity to help build a realm where kindness isn't remarkable because it's so rare, but commonplace because we've created systems that nurture it. She looked at Rowan, seeing both the king he was required to be and the person she had come to love deeply. You taught me that I was worth more than survival, that my perspective and voice mattered. Together, we've begun building something better than what we inherited. A Frostmoor where status is earned rather than assumed, where the measure of strength is how we treat those with less power, where every person is seen and valued regardless of their designation or origin. She turned back to the crowd. This isn't finished work. It will take generations to fully transform these systems, to root out all the prejudices and inequalities that run so deep. But we've started. And I promise, as your queen consort, to never forget where I came from, or the struggles that still exist for too many in our realm. Every policy I advocate for, every reform I push forward, every decision I make will be guided by the memory of what it felt like to be invisible, dismissed, and discarded. Because that memory is not a weakness. It's my greatest strength. The applause that followed was thunderous, though she could see Lord Garrett's replacement looking disgruntled in the crowd. There would always be resistance, always be people who preferred the old ways and resented being pushed toward change. But looking at the faces before her, at the lower district residents who had traveled to witness one of their own, elevated to the highest position in the realm, at the Omegas who saw in her story proof that their limitations were socially constructed rather than inherent, at the young people who were growing up in a realm that told them their worth wasn't predetermined by their designation, Leora knew the struggle was worth it. That evening, alone with Rowan in their private quarters, she finally allowed herself to fully feel the magnitude of the transformation. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "That day in the square when you announced everything? The complications it created? The resistance we've faced?" Rowan pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her. "Never," he said firmly. "You've made me a better king and a better person. You've pushed me to see beyond my own blind spots and limitations. And you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. A true partner who challenges me and supports me, and never lets me settle for comfortable lies." "I love you," Leora said simply. "Not because you're a king, or because you elevated me, or because of anything you've given me. I love you because of who you are when all the royal trappings are stripped away. Someone who tries, genuinely and persistently, to do what's right even when it's difficult." "And I love you," Rowan replied, "for all the reasons I fell for you in those first conversations. Your integrity, your resilience, your refusal to let hardship make you cruel, your ability to see people, including me, as we actually are, rather than as we're supposed to be." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the city they now ruled jointly, over the realm they were slowly, painstakingly reshaping into something more just. The work would never be finished. There would always be new challenges, new problems to solve, new resistance to overcome. But they would face it together, sustained by the memory of shared bread and honest conversation, by the knowledge that transformation was possible even when it seemed impossible, by the conviction that every person deserved to be seen and valued regardless of where they started in life. In the lower district of Frostmoor, in a small bakery that smelled eternally of rising dough, Margaret closed her shop for the evening and smiled to herself. She had known that first day when a small Omega child appeared beneath her stairs that there was something special about Leora. Not special in the sense of being extraordinary or destined for greatness, special in the simpler, more important sense of being fundamentally good, despite every reason to become otherwise. The world had tried to break that goodness, to crush it beneath poverty and exclusion and exhaustion. But it had survived and grown and eventually transformed not just Leora herself, but the entire realm she now helped to rule. And if that wasn't proof that kindness mattered, that small acts of human decency could ripple out in ways impossible to predict or measure, Margaret didn't know what was. She locked the bakery door and walked home through streets that were cleaner and safer than they had been 3 years ago, past buildings that had been repaired and reinforced, past neighbors who had more food in their larders and more hope in their hearts. The change was subtle but real, and it had started with one Omega refusing to walk past a suffering stranger without stopping to help. Sometimes, Margaret reflected, the most revolutionary act was simply treating others as if they mattered. Everything else followed from that.